So, it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Radha Friedman, and Radha has been in the global development community here in the Seattle area for a very long time. A lot of people know Radha, and I've even run into people who don't live here that said, oh, I know Radha. Our paths have crossed. So she's been in global development and gender equity for 25 years. And she's worked for organizations such as Landesa, that we all know here, where she helped found the Landesa Center for Women's Land Rights. She also worked for a long time at the World Justice Project and the SKS Foundation and the Global Center for Gender Equality at Stanford University. Her early years of her life were actually spent in India and going back and forth from India to the US, which gave her a really unique perspective and empathy, obviously, but really fueled her work for girls in particular and women's rights. More recently, she has been advising philanthropists on funding decisions with a mission to create more equity in funding and philanthropy that can be really, truly transformational. That's why we asked her to speak today. And she takes on what she calls a feminist approach to philanthropy and tries to work with female philanthropists through their own personal giving and approaches. She has a really cool podcast called Radical Good. I encourage you to check that out. And most recently, she wrote a book, and she'll be talking about that today. The book is called Fundraising Without Burnout: Radically Reimagining Philanthropy to Transform Your Impact. And she will have some of these books today for sale. It'll be up near the registration, and she'll be signing them, so I encourage you to check that out. So today she'll be talking about a book, but also about how the NGO community can really come together and avoid burnout, but also, again, messages for philanthropists on how to engage to really lift up this ecosystem that we all have. So with that, it's my honor to bring, and before I forget, Radha will also be joined by Sumi Bhat-Kincaid, who's also been in our community for a long time, who will be having, Radha will speak for a little while and then have a conversation with Sumi. Okay? Come on up.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with all of you today. And I just realized this morning that I stood on stage at the very first Global Washington Conference when Nicholas Kristof was previewing his book. So I had a very weird full circle moment when I was getting ready for the conference today. But it's so great to be with all of you. I'd love to start by just asking you to raise your hand if any of you in the room have ever experienced burnout. And if you're eating, be careful with your forks. I don't want to start a food fight. Okay, great. So if you raised your hand, you're not alone. Today, burnout is at an all-time high. That's why I wrote a book about it. And somewhere around 80% of employees are reporting feeling emotionally drained from their work, and 1 in 4 right now are reporting feeling severe burnout. And that's not good. And maybe it's not surprising for our sector, right? Because nonprofits have been on the front lines, especially these last few years. We have been undertaking heroic work to protect the fundamental rights of people in our communities. And with all of the turbulence in our government these last few years in our own country, as well as rising authoritarianism in other countries, closing space for civil societies, nonprofits and NGOs have really had to step up and take on a disproportionate share of the work. And it's been really heavy. And I know we've all been watching the headlines about the Great Resignation. And this is happening, obviously, across all sectors, right? It's not just happening in our sector. But it's important to talk about what is happening and how it's specifically affecting our sector, and particularly the people who are charged with raising funds to keep our sector going. Because burnout rates are high, and as RuPaul says, we in danger, girl. So for years now, we've been sounding the alarm bells about the challenges in philanthropy, the inequities in the power imbalances, the myths about a nonprofit's impact somehow being tied in any way to its overhead costs, the reticence of funders to spend more than 5% a year of what they have, and the $234 billion that is sitting unused in people's donor-advised funds right now. And so consequently, the high rates of turnover among development directors are probably not a huge surprise. And COVID has really exacerbated this. We've seen the exhaustion of working on the front lines to protect communities when people fell through the cracks during this once-in-a-century pandemic. And we also see that fundraisers have to repeat heartbreaking stories of what's happening in their communities over and over in order to get donors to invest. And there's a weariness from philanthropy's performative words followed by compassion fatigue. So for all of these reasons, many development staff, they're not just quitting their jobs, they're leaving the sector altogether. And that poses a big challenge for us because we cannot protect the fundamental rights of our communities without resources, and we need fundraisers to go out there and develop resources and build and steward those relationships in order to ensure their sustainability. So I want to take a little bit of a deeper look at this. Several years ago, the Haas Junior Fund teamed up with Compass Point, and they decided to undertake some research to find out what was going on because their grantees continued to come to them with these struggles around their development challenges. So they surveyed over 2,500 development directors as well as executive directors, and they were trying to figure out why are there so many visionary, incredible organizations that seem to be caught in this vicious cycle of turnover and they aren't meeting their revenue goals. And the report, it's called Underdeveloped, you should read it if you haven't already, basically pointed to 3 key findings. Okay, so the first finding was they found out, and this will not be a surprise to many of you in this room, the development director position had basically become a revolving door with high turnover and long vacancies. Second thing they found was that nonprofits struggled to find qualified candidates. I would interpret that finding in the report as asking fundraisers to do way too many things as part of the challenge and having unrealistic expectations. And third, there was a lack of support and capacity for fundraisers. And by that, what is happening is fundraisers would go into a new organization for a new job and find out there's no development database. There's no, fundraising committee. There's nobody here that's going to support them in doing their work. So as a result, the study found that 50% of development directors that they surveyed reported being frustrated, exhausted, and said they were planning to quit. 50%. That's half of our development workforce. So add to that data the effects of the COVID pandemic. And one of the most significant things that we saw during COVID were disproportionate effects for different people based on social determinants, right? Race, gender, disability, LGBTQ identity, and anyone who stood at the intersection of those different identities had a magnified impact. So we don't have time to unpack all of this today, but find me in the hall because I'd love to. But the gendered effects of COVID are really particularly significant for why we're seeing so much turnover right now. Because our sector is powered by a majority of women. And what we experienced during COVID these last few years was also referred to by many as a she session, right? We remember reading that in the headlines because so many women dropped out of the workforce. And of course, that's because of all of the social norms where women were expected to take care of children when schools were closed and take care of their families and do all of the invisible unpaid labor in the household and hold their full-time jobs, and something had to give. In 1 month alone, I remember reading the US economic reports, and it showed that 100% of the jobs lost were by women, 100%. And all of this is significant because in fundraising and development, we have an even more disproportionate gender issue because 80% of development roles are held by women. And yet, when we look at the senior leadership of those roles, that number flips. 80% of the senior leadership, so a chief development officer, for example, roles are held by men. Why do these inequities matter? Besides the fact that we should always be paying to equity all the time. We need to be aware of what is causing people to burn out. And if you think that you aren't going to advance in your career, there's no possibility for you to hold a higher leadership position, then why bother? Second, we need to understand that burnout affects people differently based on gender. So men typically report that burnout makes them feel distant or disconnected from their work, whereas women tend to feel a lot of anxiety and imposter syndrome. And third, we need to pay attention to how our workplaces and how our philanthropic sector writ large is contributing to the burnout, including centering the needs of our donors rather than our communities, and asking us to jump through a lot of unnecessary hoops like complex reporting requirements with lots of metrics involved. It's like we're juggling chainsaws on fire while we're trying to walk on a tightrope. We cannot pin all of our hopes and dreams on one person in the organization and then give them all of these expectations and then be surprised when they burn out because they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And we can't hire our way out of this because the cycle will just repeat. If any of you are a development leader in your nonprofit and you're nodding, I'm seeing some nodding heads right now. Maybe this story sounds familiar to you, right? You join a nonprofit because you fall in love with its mission. You see its potential to change the world and you get so excited about the possibility to be a part of that change yourself. But somewhere along the way, and it's usually pretty quickly, you realize now all of the responsibility is on your shoulders. If the organization thrives or fails, that's on you. And it's a heavy weight to carry. Best case scenario, you succeed and you raise the funds that you need for this year's budget. Now that mountaintop that you just scaled to get to the top just becomes the benchmark for next year and you have to scale an even bigger mountain. And if you don't succeed, if your best donor decides to do a strategy refresh or they make a pledge and then ghost you, you are responsible for the fallout of that. You have to bear witness as your organization tries to struggle without the resources it needs for its programs. You know the need for those programs in the communities. And you might also have to bear witness to watching your colleagues lose their job, and your own job is on the line too. Because when you're a development director, your role is highly visible and public. People associate you with the organization that you're working for, and often you have to use your own social capital and reach out to your own friend networks, right, to fill the tables at your events. So you're putting your own reputation on the line as well. It's no wonder that right now, so many fundraisers are burning out, and the average stay of a development director is 18 months. 18 months. So I wrote this book, Fundraising Without Burnout, as a love letter to all of the people who are powering the sector, because I want you to know that I see you, I honor you and the important work you do, and I think that this sector is often underappreciated and misunderstood. And I know what it feels like to do your work because I did it and I lived it. I scaled my own Mount Everest. I helped my organization bring in more money than they had ever seen. We 4x'd our budget. We opened multiple new offices overseas. We won all of these prestigious awards. But instead of feeling successful for raising all of these funds, I was the most exhausted and miserable that I had ever been in my life. And the fall down that mountain was brutal, let me tell you. I wrote this book because I want us all to know that part of the reason we're exhausted and burned out is not because we're not good enough, we just couldn't find the right funder, we just couldn't write the best grant. It's because we're working to change inequitable and oppressive systems from inside inequitable and oppressive systems. And those systems are not designed to help you out. They're designed to make it so difficult to change the status quo that eventually you just become exhausted and you burn out and you give up. And we cannot give up. There's so much at stake. Like, look at what the Max Foundation is doing in the lives that they're changing. Every one of us got into this work because we were inspired by somebody who came before us to change the world, and now it's our turn. So, with that, I'd love to invite Sumi Bhat-Kincaid to join me for a conversation about what's going on behind the burnout and what we can do to change it. Thank you.
We're going old school with the mic. Mm-hmm. So we can go from this to karaoke in no time.
We're going to do karaoke. Perfect.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Sumi Bhat-Kincaid. I am a fundraising consultant and also am a nonprofit recruiter. And I'm just so honored to have been invited to chat with Radha about her book. Just having known you, it's funny, this is a little bit full circle too, that I've been part of the Global Washington community. And the first time I saw Radha was her standing on this stage. so I said, I always thought you were so fabulous, and it's so amazing that I get to call you a friend and get to see you through this success. So it's pretty amazing.
Likewise.
I'll get started and stop being so chatty. So Radha, I was driving in a Lyft this morning, and I said, my friend wrote a book, and she was like, how did she write a book? And it's pretty amazing. I really wanted to hear from you what prompted you to write this book. What inspired you to do this?
Thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you two, of all people. So a few reasons. I have notes here just to keep me from going too far into the weeds, but the biggest reason was I saw the writing on the wall. And the last few years, I've been working as an independent philanthropic advisor, and I also started doing something that I call philanthrotherapy with many of my clients. What I was noticing was it wasn't just putting together portfolios and dockets that were making the most meaningful difference in the world. It was when they would call me up in sheer frustration and tears and say, I can't figure this thing out, can you just talk me through it? And we dug really deep into issues of scarcity, and where their feelings of not enoughness or enoughness were coming from, and what it would take to really change behavior and get past that scarcity mindset. And I also started doing some coaching, and every single person that came to me shared the same feelings of imposter syndrome, and they thought it was them. And there's so much isolation that's happening, and what I wanted to do with this book was come out of the closet again and break the silence on this conversation. I never hear this discussed in any conference that I attend. And yet everyone is talking about how burnt out they feel doing this kind of work. So that's the reason.
Yes, and part of the reason I'm up here is I totally relate to that feeling. And I also relate to the fact that the clients that I've supported now, I never went in planning on supporting them in this way, but I ended up coaching too. I'm working with development leaders who are often a sole development leader in an organization, right, where they're trying to maybe raise $1.5 million or something like that. And they're trying to wear so many hats, and it's so much that the coaching aspect of my work started to come out, because they just needed a peer, another person who wasn't somebody who is someone they could take risks with without kind of jeopardizing their position as well. Yeah. So really relate to that, and did a lot of nodding during the book too when I was reading it. So can you share a little bit about your own burnout story, what you're comfortable telling us?
Yes, I can. And I think it's important, I'm gonna back up a little bit, because I think it's important to talk about the work I did as a fundraiser, which led me to do work as a grant maker, which led me to do work as an advisor. It's a little bit of it's a journey. We're gonna go on a journey. So several years ago, I had the opportunity to work for a beloved organization called Andessa, and it was an opportunity where all of our fundraising dreams came true. Literally, the dream came true. I just started working for them one day when somebody called, and it was a research institute that wanted to have a meeting with us. And I didn't think anything of this, right? Because we started as a research institute under the umbrella of UW and eventually spun out to become a 501c3. So I thought this was just going to be research institute talking to research institute. So I was very surprised when at the meeting they asked us, have you ever thought what you would do if somebody gave you $1 million? And we were like deer in the headlights. We had no answer for this question because, like so many nonprofits I had worked for, we lived with a scarcity mindset, and we prided ourselves on how much we could do with so little. That was our metric of success. Like, you need 3 jobs done, but you only have 1 employee? Sure, we can do that. You don't have any money for the travel budget? Of course our CEO and founder can share a hotel room again. And we didn't have an answer when this question came because we thought that way. And we realized we actually need to sit down and make some space for this. And when we did that exercise, the whole energy in our office changed. The walls became filled with this abundance and enthusiasm and excitement. What would it take? What would that look like to make the most seismic shifts? And for me, it was a really important moment because that research institute that had asked us for that meeting and prompted that question ended up being backed by a very prominent philanthropist who did give us a lot of money and then introduced us to his wealthy friends. And so it was a moment for me where I realized there's so much that could be possible. Like, he just appeared like some magical philanthropy genie and granted us our wishes. And it was exciting because I had an idea, and the abundance thinking is the thing that allowed me to push for it. I wanted to put a gender lens on our work, but it wasn't an easy sell. Maybe some of you have had this experience where it's not easy selling things to the board of directors sometimes. And it took a little bit of pushing because we hadn't ever been funded for it before. And so there wasn't necessarily a willingness to believe that somebody would really want to invest. And that had to justify the staff effort and time that we were taking. But eventually, we did have an event where we shared this idea, put a gender lens on our work, and you better believe it was sold out, and we had all kinds of funders in the room, and it bolstered our confidence and helped us go bigger and better, including getting access to CGI. And once we got inside a room with that many donors and told our story, I mean, we just made it rain. Like, if ever there was a moment in my life where I felt like Scrooge McDuck swimming in a pool of gold, it was this moment. We had one funder after another that was giving us multi-million-dollar funds. And I thought, like, this is it. You know, we've done it. But what happened was so much funding came into the organization so quickly, even though we had planned, we thought, for everything, that I blinked and it felt like I wasn't in the same organization anymore. And I want to be really clear, like, this organization is the love of my life. It just happens to be the place where I was working. I hear these stories all of the time. Many of you have probably experienced the same thing. And I'm very keenly watching what's happening to organizations who are getting funding from Mackenzie Scott for this very reason. Suddenly, we went from being a very flat, small, informal organization to having a ton of hierarchy. And so the things that were possible before simply were not possible anymore. There was infighting, there was a lot of hurt feelings over who got what share of the budget, and people interpreted that as a measure of their own worth. And power moves were plotted, and good people, both old staff and new staff, got pushed out of the organization. And I remember having a revelation, standing there looking around at what was happening and thinking, wow, if this is success at fundraising, I don't think I belong here. I don't think this is for me. And so I pivoted because I thought, I did everything right? I succeeded we surpassed our fundraising goals. I followed all of the best practices, and I've never felt more burned out and exhausted. I couldn't even get out of bed and muster the will to go into the office in the morning, and I should have felt on top of the world. So I decided to pivot, and I wanted to stay close to the work, but I wanted to get off the merry-go-round and do something different, and so I became a grant maker. And once I stepped onto the other side of the table where I was making the decisions about where the grants were going to go, I completely understood why I had burned out. Because I was only one of many decision makers, and there were these incredible proposals that would come across my desk where I thought, this is so creative, so innovative. Look at the people leading this project. Like, they've never even had a grant before. We would be their first investment. This is badass. It's amazing. And the other decision makers around the table would say, that seems pretty risky. And instead, they would say, I would like to fund this proposal because, I don't know, this guy just reminds me of me when I was younger. And most of those other decision makers around the table tended to be, pale male and Yale. And so it helped me understand, okay, I've spent my whole career working to fund gender equity, and it's specifically moving more resources to women and girls of color who receive less than 1% of philanthropy. And the whole time, I interpreted that as my failing, that I couldn't get more funding and investment in social capital into this field when it's a system and sector issue. And so it helped me understand why it was that I burned out, and I became an advisor to help build those bridges between funders and nonprofits so that that didn't continue to happen to others. Thanks for going on the journey. That was long.
But it is really interesting. You've got such a variety of perspective, around the fact that it is a systemic issue. And it's something that I've had to learn in this process in the last couple of years, that I've sort of taken a step back where As a fundraiser, I found myself thinking, I need to stop doing the same thing and expecting different results. Like, I need to step back, but also like the systems need to stop doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? And we seem to be sort of stuck in that cycle. And I'll just layer on that, as a woman of color, being in that position is also really complicated.
Yes.
And I said I wouldn't be this vulnerable up here, but when you're talking to your therapist and she's a woman of color and she looks at you and says, we live in a system here where when you don't fit into the box that has been defined for you by honestly like a white dominant capitalist environment, you internalize those things as failings of your own, and you don't realize that there's a system that does not support the way that you think, the way that you choose to build relationships, the way that you interact with this world. And so, the burnout factor there kicks in. I don't want to say any sooner. I don't want to belittle anybody else's experience, but it feels like you're kind of battling. The hill is even more steep in a way, And
100%.
So I really relate to that, and I really appreciate just calling out that it is a system. It's about the system, and all the self-blame is just damaging to all of us.
Yes,
So,
and everyone's suffering silently without really talking about it openly in these kinds of forums.
And then we talk to each other and we're like, no way, you too, right? There's just so much mirroring, I think, when we have these conversations, which is why it's good to be able to have it in this forum with everybody here too.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, what do you think is driving the high rates of burnout? I mean, you've touched on some of that, but maybe in a little bit more detail. Like, what do you think is really driving that in the sector?
Yeah, so I wanted to share, this is why I have my notes, because I would never be able to repeat this verbatim, but burnout has become prevalent enough that the World Health Organization now lists it in their international classification of diseases. And they describe it as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Actually, Dr. Maslach, the researcher who initially coined the term, described it as an erosion of the human soul. But I think that the World Health Organization definition is really important because it reminds us that this is a systemic and sectoral issue, which means it needs a systemic and sectoral response to it. So, in the interest of keeping this short, these are the top three things that I think are driving it. The first is we really place the blame on individuals. We place the blame on individual development directors. And we treat this as a you problem, and that leads to all the shame and the self-doubt and all of the things that we've been talking about. You just need better work-life balance. You just need to take a yoga class. You just need to lean in, girl. And it's a sectoral problem, right? I can tell you as a coach, and you probably have seen the same experience, that imposter syndrome combined with perfectionism is the recipe for burnout. That's where you're headed. The second thing is we don't give fundraisers enough support, and yet our expectations are crazy high. It takes time to build relationships. Relationships are core to being a successful fundraiser, and if people are in and out of there in 18 months, we've got work to do. And the third thing is we are not talking about this with our donors. We're not talking about this as a sector as much as we should be, although today is a great start. But also, we tend to be having conversations in totally separate rooms from our funding partners, but we're all working towards the same issues. So this is a time for us, I think, to really address that.
Yes. Yeah, I agree, and I think some of the best relationships I've seen with funders has really been when funders, they lean in, right? Where I know saying lean in always feels a little weird, but but they step forward and say, tell us more about what you're doing, tell us more about what your priorities are. One of the things that I've loved that I've seen. One of the nonprofits I've worked with, their funder says, we don't need a report from you. We just want to have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
Like, let's talk, right? Like twice a year, tell me how it's going. In what ways can I support you?
Yeah.
And so you're not like scrambling to like do the 15 spreadsheets and like the giant Dropbox, right? I'm looking at people I know who are familiar with this, And so I think that it's really, it's like we can only do so much, because the thing that I've also realized is that like, even as the nonprofit sector is shifting and we're changing and we're having these conversations, there's still a barrier when funders are not changing in that way. And like, this is a little example that isn't exactly about burnout, but like I work with an organization that has a collective decision-making structure, right? So there's no ED. Everyone starts at the same level. They all start at the same salary. They collectively make decisions for the organization. But when they apply for grants, they're always asked who the ED is. And they have to fill out that piece, you know? And so they have to designate someone, which actually like has an effect on their culture, right? It affects their culture. Or their development person is called a development coordinator, but so is everyone else. But then when he is reaching out to funders, it sounds like he's a person who is not in a position to make those decisions and to talk to funders, right? And so like really needing to shift the lens of how we're thinking about that, I think is really important as well. Yeah. I also have my notes, as you can see, with this iPad. So yeah, let's talk about what we can do to start to prevent fundraising burnout.
Yeah.
What suggestions do you have? What have you seen has been successful?
Yeah, we didn't want to bum everybody out and have you all walk out of the room crying about the sad statistics out there. So there's going to be a little bit of a lift. So the good thing is burnout is preventable, it's treatable, it's reversible. It's all of those things if you pay attention to it, talk about it, and acknowledge it, right? Within a couple of months, you can reverse it. If you don't address it, though, if you just keep pushing through, if you just ignore it, it's like any other pain in your body, right? It can take 2 to 5 years to recover. So it's really in our best interest as a sector that we pay attention to it and think about some of the changes that we can make. So we need to pay attention to the culture that we're operating in. That's a big one. And because our nonprofits so often operate with that scarcity mindset that I was talking about, often there's an expectation that people will wear 20 hats and will overwork because it's for the good of the mission, right? And that gets reinforced. It leads to toxic productivity. Instead of blaming our employees for burning out, we can help by doing things to create a healthier work environment. One of those things is honestly just creating an open space where people feel comfortable talking about it. I know that sounds easier than it is to do, but it's really important to do. I mean, we can also do things to make healthier work environments like 4-day work weeks, having sabbaticals for employees. I just talked with a nonprofit organization last week that offers nonprofit employees sabbaticals after working there for 2 years, and they offer unlimited menstrual leave. I mean, I thought both of those things were pretty phenomenal. So those are, some of the great places we can start. We also need to be providing our development directors with more support. This is a team effort, right? So the expectations have to be right-sized, and so does the support for them, or else it's just going to be the road to burnout for all of us. And then finally, I really do think that we have to bring our funders to the table and have these conversations together. And as a sector, we've really got to keep pushing on the movement towards trust-based philanthropy, towards community-centric fundraising models. There are so many models out there that are coalescing. Participatory grant making, community-centric fundraising, trust-based philanthropy, that are all asking essentially for the same things, right? Unrestricted general operating support for multi-years, and not a lot of onerous reporting requirements so that they can focus on the work that needs to be done, and so that the people who are closest to the issues they're solving can be the ones that are driving the decisions instead of people, who are far removed. So I think that's a great place to start.
I also think that's a great place to conclude. So I think we have a few more minutes for Q&A if anyone would like to ask questions or argue with us, whatever.
You can also find us out in the hall to ask questions too.
Yeah, and Radha will be upstairs with her book. So
yes, indeed.
Thank you, Radha.
Yeah,
I value you. We're grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Yay! Thanks, Franco.